A quick survey. How many people are using Visual Studio 2008 today? A couple of hands. Visual Studio 2005? 2003? Oh, there's still a couple of you there. Visual Studio .NET 2002. No hands. Good. Okay. Well, for those folks that are on VS03, this is going to totally blow your mind in terms of what's here. There's been a lot of work on the website. I'm not going to touch so much on what the differences were between 03 and 05, but I'm going to focus on more of the differences between 05 and 08. In a lot of ways, Visual Studio 2008 really is what Visual Studio 2005 ought to have been in a number of levels. On the web side, though, they really kind of put their finger to the pulse of what was happening in the industry and introduced a bunch of functionality specific to what's going on right now in the web world. And so whether it's improvements in the design surface to be more compliant with CSS and styling, or really rolling and baking AJAX functionality in throughout both the IDE and the framework. They've really focused on that trend, and that's where a bulk of the new ad as far as web developers are concerned. There were a few new controls introduced. We'll talk a little bit about them, why they were introduced, and the impact to you. And then they introduced the idea of a deployment project. And this is really just a combination of a bunch of tools that were released in the Visual Studio 2005 timeframe. They put it in a pretty user interface and shipped it as part of the package. We'll also touch briefly on what's coming up in Service Pack 1, which hit beta last week. It's a pretty important service pack as far as Visual Studio 2008 goes. If you're on 08 or you're planning to go 08, SP1 is you've got to go there. There's no doubt about it. Not only is there performance improvements, but just some of the functionality that gets introduced there. And as well, just touch on some of the out-of-band releases that are happening, like the MVC framework. And I'd be happy to answer questions about where some of this stuff is going. I was at the MVP Summit with the product group a few weeks ago, so I got a bit of the inside scoop in terms of what's happening there, and I'd love to answer any specific questions that you may have. To start off with, for those folks who are on VS03 and even on VS05, what is the .NET Framework 3.5? It's kind of a misnomer. It's not really a brand new framework. It's really just an add-on to the .NET 2.0 framework. So you've got .NET 2, and it's got your core set of CLR and web services and WinForm stuff. Then they came out with 3.0. 3.0 really feels like 2.1 or 2.0.1 because all they did is added on additional bits to it. They didn't change anything in the underlying framework. And so there you got Windows Workflow and Windows Communications Foundation and some of the first bits around presentation framework. When 3.5 shipped, they did the exact same thing again. They just baked on some additional bits. And so this is where AJAX finally got rolled into the core framework. And previous to that, it was a separate release. It was, they were really working on building it up quickly, and they didn't want to have to wait till the .NET Framework 3.5 to do the first release. So they did a separate out-of-band release, and then they baked it back into the framework. And that's a trend that you're actually going to see going forward, and something you see actually even with Service Pack 1. Some of the core technologies appearing in the MVC framework have been matured enough that they've been baked into what's coming out in the Service Pack 1. And that's why I say 3.5 Service Pack 1 is more feature pack than it is a service pack in a lot of ways. Some of the other interesting things that are happening in the .NET 3.5 timeframe is MVC as far as development metaphors. The message there is they're not dropping web forms development. Web forms is still absolutely plays. MVC is just an experiment right now to figure out, does this make sense to make further investment in there? I was actually surprised to know there's really only 2 people working on MVC framework inside Microsoft in terms of core developers. So versus the rest of the ASP.NET team, it's a fairly small effort. Externally, sometimes we get mixed messages thinking that MVC is the next big thing and web forms is going to go away, and that's definitely not the case. It's a supplement. So let's get right into it in terms of the design experience. I mean, I can't show you a ton of PowerPoints better than, I might as well just dig right into the product. The first major thing that they've done with Visual Studio overall, and you'll see this in a bunch of the bits of it, you'll notice that they've got this idea of multi-targeting. And it's the idea that within the Visual Studio framework in 08, they wanted you to be able to upgrade to 08 without losing the ability to develop against previous versions. So if all of you out there are using Visual Studio 2005, you actually don't lose anything by jumping up to 08. Nothing changes. You can still develop .NET 2 apps on Visual Studio 8. What do you get out of that? You get all the improvements in the design surface, the stability improvements, and everything that the IDE gives you right out of the gate there. So right away they've designed it so that you can get in there and continue to develop 2.0 apps and benefit. So as you're going to start any of the projects out there, you're going to go ahead and select the version of the framework that you're going to build with. And I think this is, again, one of those key components that gets you up and running. You have the idea of web application projects as well as websites. And this was something that was introduced originally in VS03, the web application project. Then they took it away in VS05 and created websites. And then they realized, oops, we kind of broke things, and then shipped it as an add-on to 05. What they've done in 08 is they've just shipped both and said, hey, if you want to just develop without a solution file or a project file and just go straight against the file system, you can do that, or you can go project. They've enabled you to support both. And so that gives you a lot of flexibility. One of the other things that they introduced in 05 that kind of caught on was this whole notion of master pages. Who here has used master pages in their current projects? Who here has tried to nest a master page inside a master page? A couple of hands. So the problem with nesting master pages in the previous one is you pretty much gave up the designer at the point that you nested the master page. So when you go and create a master page today, you'll just start a new master page and you'll go from there. But let's say, and the scenario is I might have, let's say, a site master page that has the overall frame of my web application, and then I've got a module master page that might be specific to my user management module or something like that. And so I want to use both of them. So I'm going to create a secondary module master page. And in the past, when I wanted to inherit from one master page to the next one, I couldn't do that. Today, all I have to do is go into here and basically specify in my secondary master page, the master page file is equal to site master. Get rid of all the defining stuff, because I define that at the top level one. And then actually implement my content items. So I'm going to do content placeholder equals 1. That comes from my master page. And then I'm going to do stuff inside. This is the child master page. And so let's go back up to the site one, put some text there so you can see this is the parent master page. Now, you tried to do this under VS05 today, you go to the design surface and it's going to absolutely break. You do it in VS08 and you're actually going to get both. Oops, I forgot parent control failed on the outer HTML. So the content placeholder ID equals All right, I'm just running into a small content placeholder issue there. I am just going to continue on because I've probably just, oh, I know what it is. I forgot to run at. Oops, when you got the run at. All right, let's try this again. Go to my design surface. So now I've got actually both the parent and the child master page all rolled into one. So this was, is one of those annoying things that was there in VS05. And again, it was brought up through people applying master pages and it really taking off. And so they listened and said, hey, that really is something that's got to change. The other thing they introduced, and again, these are just kind of little nice things, they introduced the idea of split editing. And so what this allows you to do is as you're making changes, it appears in the other side. And so you're no longer doing that switch between design source, design source. It's updating in real time. And it allows you to be just that little bit more productive in respect to the overall design surface and making those changes. Going one step further in the CSS side, how many people here use CSS inside their web applications today? Good portion of hands. How many people actually do proper data separation from your styling and stuff like that? Okay, so CSS is one of those things, like we've got a team at our work where our web developers produce the XHTML pages, and then we've got web designers and graphic designers that are responsible for the CSS. And one of the biggest kind of complaints we hear is that developers don't really understand CSS in terms of how to apply it properly. Well, part of it from a dev perspective is our tools never really exposed it before. There's a lot of things like table-based layout, which in a web design world and CSS designers, they would absolutely slap you on the hand and say, don't use the table for layout. Well, they've been hearing that from a Visual Studio perspective and looking to empower people with some more functionality around how to expose and get used to CSS as it exists within the Visual Studio environment. So what they've done is they've exposed a whole set of designers around CSS, and you'll see that here in the CSS properties rule here. So let's do a .mystyle. And right out of the gate, you're going to get, as you're defining CSS, all of the IntelliSense around it. So you never have to remember exactly what was it that I was trying to do. So let's do color red, and it's going to pick up and do the IntelliSense around it. And then that way, when I go to apply it, I'll be able to go ahead and do a div and go class equals, class equals my style. And then when I hit the design surface, I've got this entire CSS properties dialog, which is showing me all the properties associated with, again, the CSS. Now, where that gets really complex is when you get into multiple rules applied against any given class. So you might have something that says, at the top level div, here's a bunch of styles, and then in an inner div, here's another set of styles. And debugging those just are a real pain. And so they've exposed that through a really nice CSS properties window. And that used to be available as a Visual Studio 05 add-in. They've just baked it into the framework. The other thing that they've done is created this style application toolbar, and it helps you figure out exactly what's been applied to where within your environment. And so you can see here right away, it's showing me my current target rule, which is my style. It allows me right in here, right within the ID, to start defining new styles. And on top of that, it's giving me a very detailed dialogue to help me define those styles with. And it's really kind of useful, especially for things like padding and borders and stuff like that. They've got a nice little kind of hint there to say, margins versus borders versus padding, and how that all works in terms of the box model with CSS. So as you're going in and defining, you can just drop down the font family, and they'll even pre-select for you kind of the common type of font families that exist out there. And you can just go in and set your properties all you want around this particular style, and then define a brand new style right in line. It's going to go ahead, define it, apply it, and if you go back to the source here, here's my new style. It's right within there. So you get that true, kind of full style sheet there. If we go ahead and add, let's say, a new style sheet. And I've got my, IntelliSense in here. I do background, blue. What I'm going to get here is I right-click is Add New Style Rule, and I can add a new rule. And again, this is one of those things from a CSS design perspective that was always perplexing. How do I apply something to divs where certain conditions exist? So let's say I want to go apply a rule. Let's scroll down here and find div. And I want only when my div element ID is foo. And then what it's going to do is it's going to define for me what exactly that rule looks like, and then I can go ahead and define. So just a little assistive components in there to help you design styles. Also, you can do certain things around validation. It recognizes CSS 2.1, 2.0, and 1.0 right out of the gate, and then if you're developing for IE6, it'll also take into consideration the IE hacks, and that's the validation component to make sure that when you're developing, you're applying the right set of rules that exist. Because kind of like HTML, they've got their own set of rules as far as what versions. For the most part, most modern browsers support CSS 2 and 2.1. So that's kind of CSS in a nutshell as far as what you get out of the gate here. Again, just designing it to make it easier for you as a developer when you're building out your design experience. So we talked a little bit about the idea of the split view and the master pages and style management. And so it's some kind of key things that help you design better user experiences from a visual aspect when you're playing with the design surface. From the multi-targeting perspective, 2, 3.0, and 3.5 are supported. 1.1, 1.0 are out the window. They won't do multi-targeting on that. So if you're doing 1.1 today, you're stuck back in the VS 2003 world, and it doesn't look like there's any hope for that to change. One thing you should be aware of, though, is if you do go to Visual Studio 2008 and you are doing backwards compatibility work with 2.0, it will modify your project and your solution files and add some attributes, making it incompatible with VS05. So it's still going to turn out a .NET 2.0 assembly and bits, but you won't be able to open that project file in Visual Studio 2005 anymore. And it's because they throw in a few attributes, and then when Visual Studio 2005 looks at it, goes, whoa, I don't know what those are, and then throws the project file out. If there's enough demand, I'm sure they'll fix that. They'll release a hotfix for VS05. But my feeling is they're just going to move forward and get on with Visual Studio 2008 and beyond. The next big thing as far as where they've made their investment is in the scripting side. How many people here write client-side JavaScript today, whether it be Ajax or so? Quite a few of you. So this is really a major investment in Visual Studio 2008, and there's things like Intellisense and debugging, and we're going to go through all of that and kind of show you where they've made investments in that sense. So let's go ahead and close some of this stuff out, get rid of my styles here for clean things out. So I'm going to just do a div id equals foo, because I'll need that a little bit later. So the first thing you need to do, you'll notice, is that you start to get some type inference here. They're doing some stuff within the processing engine and the IntelliSense engine to start recognizing a variety of different items. So let's say var bar. So this is just an object as far as JavaScript is concerned until I start assigning something to it. Once I assign something like an integer to it, I'm going to now have a set number of operations that JavaScript's going to recognize specifically to integers. Unfortunately, I can't really zoom in a whole lot there, but basically what's happening is if I go bar dot, you'll see that I've got 2 exponential, and that's an operation that only works on integers there. So if I were to do that, I would be able to do stuff, and of course it wants a parameter. I'm just going to say 2. Now if I were to go bar equals foo, then I do a bar dot, and suddenly now it's coming back to all the string operations that would be relevant to a string. So I haven't said foo is a string bar is a string or an integer. It's just picked that up by way of what I've assigned to it. And so there's a bit of intelligence there in terms of the overall JavaScript engine to try and figure out what you're doing. And that's really useful as you're sitting there coding the client-side script, because there are no notion of type from a declarative perspective in JavaScript. The other thing as well that they've gone into is, again, looking at what people are doing with JavaScript, is building in this idea of JavaScript class libraries. So you'll see, in particular, some of the assets from the Ajax development roll into the framework. So you've got Ajax client libraries and behaviors and controls. The library thing's kind of neat. So if I go ahead and do a function, it's called bar, and I'll take in a name as a parameter, and let's go return name, or we'll just we'll just have it do nothing for now. If I go back here and then go ahead and include my, let's do a scripts, source equals, did I save it? What did I call it? Client's library, type equals text JavaScript. I'm going to go down to my thing here. I'm going to start typing in bar, and automatically it's picked up that my library exists, and it's starting to expose the fact that there's a function there named bar. So as I start typing, I actually get all the functions from there. So I'm starting to get the first kind of hints of IntelliSense. But wait, there's more. They've included documentation as well, and I think this is pretty cool. So now I can say, you know, a function that does something, excuse the typos, and I'm going to go ahead and start documenting that parameter called name. I'm going to say your name, and then I'll do a returns something, save that. And notice this is the exact same syntax that exists in C# today. So now when I go and call bar, and oops, have to give it a second here to load that up. Let me just come back here. And for some reason, it doesn't like me. Summary, param, name, param, returns, yep. Oh, sorry, return. All right, I'm just going to even show it with you with something a little cooler. I'll pull up Jquery because I know that one for sure works. I've got a typo somewhere in there, and it's instead of trying to find it. So let's go pull up Jquery. So Jquery is, you know, for those who don't know, is just a JavaScript query environment. It allows you to do all kinds of fancy stuff on top of the framework, or on top of the document object model within the browser. So if I want to go ahead and start doing some Jquery Intellisense, I'm going to need my jQuery.js. Then I'm also going to need this file here called jQuery.Intellisense. And where do you get this? There's a guy out there off infobasis.com, and if you just Google jQuery Intellisense, it's like the first link. He's interpreted the XML documentation for jQuery and automatically stuffed in all the IntelliSense for it. So you notice here, as you look at the IntelliSense file, it's actually got all the documentation built in line there, and he's got definitely everything sorted out and working properly, hopefully. So let's go ahead and include jQuery.js. And then what we're going to do is include the JavaScript, and this is just a little trick. The client side, the IntelliSense really is not useful to our end users. The IntelliSense is really only for us as developers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and place inside a placeholder the reference to the IntelliSense file, because I really don't need that to render on the server, or on the server side, or on the client side, I should say, for my end users, because they're not going to pop it open and do some IntelliSense inside of it. So I've just taken a placeholder, I've said visible false, and I put my jQuery bits in there, and that hopefully, if all goes well, I should be able to start plugging away at some jQuery functions here in just a second. Now, you don't have to do it inside the placeholder. There's also a fancy new notation with // reference path equals jQuery.IntelliSense.js. This is another notation that you can use to reference out to the JS file. So right away, you'll notice I get, when I get into IntelliSense, I get my $, which jQuery likes. And as I start typing, let me just bring this up a little higher so people can see. As I start typing, you'll notice right underneath the covers here, I've got actually full documentation for my jQuery syntax. So I just do, let's say, document, .ready, function, and then, oops. And then I'm going to go ahead and define a function here. I'm going to say, go grab anchor tags, and I'm going to toggle the function, and I'm going to say function again. I'm going to say anything that's tagged with .stuff. I'm going to go ahead and hide it, and I'm going to do it slowly. And then I'll do the other side of the function, and then I'll say .stuff, .show fast. So this is really mostly interesting to those jQuery folks out there. But essentially what I'm doing is I'm writing a dynamic function in line that performs a function on the jQuery. Now you notice as I closed the last bracket there, it did something really kind of cool. And something that I've been really hard pressed to find anywhere in terms of any editor is something that would format my JavaScript. So in Service Pack 1 of Visual Studio 2008, they're actually shipping code formatting JavaScript. So now you can actually reformat all that code that it's really, really tough to understand out there. So let's go ahead and toss an anchor tag in here. So href, we'll make it go nowhere. Oops. And we'll give it a class of stuff, and then say hello. Let's go ahead and launch this. Where did my pages go? The Visual Studio disappeared. Hang on one second here. Let's crank that back open. Unfortunately, that's the joy of working with Service Pack 1 beta stuff. And that's going to take just a second for it to crank through. So while that's waiting to happen, basically, the function itself really is just a JavaScript function that does stuff on the DOM, nothing really different. What I got there, though, is that idea of Intellisense within these libraries. So we've got all these great libraries out there like EXT, the Yahoo UI. Now we get the full kind of server-side development experience of Intellisense and documentation on the client side as well. So it kind of really starts to get full fidelity between client and server-side development, and it actually makes it a whole lot easier. Because JavaScript, was never really meant to be a full-blown first-class language. And what we've seen through Ajax, through things like Flash using ActionScript, JavaScript's actually become a fairly important language. And so now it's only after the fact that we're tacking on some of these components that make it a lot more pleasant to build inside of. So let's just go ahead and pull that back open. Let's do a Control F5, cross our fingers, see if we can get it to crash again. Nope. All right, excellent. So there's my hello. Nothing really super fancy there. I click on it and it disappears, and that's jQuery doing its thing. So nothing really, crazy there. I don't want to spend all day writing some jQuery here, but the idea is that I get that code formatting in Intellisense, and that makes things really, really nice. Now, what happens if you're coding against web services? Again, one of these things that really came out with Ajax was this idea that I want to do asynchronous callbacks to the server and get stuff. And in the past, it was just a real pain in the butt to figure out what exactly do I need to do to access that web service. So let's go ahead and start up a new web service here. I'm just going to create an ASMX web service. Right out of the gate, they're baking in a bunch of the stuff that, again, was part of ASP.NET Ajax to enable you to do client-side call back and forth from the server. So the script service tag that was there as part of Ajax is just there. All you have to do is uncomment it, and then I've got my hello world method. So let's go ahead and go back to our code here. Before I go any further, what I need is a script manager. So let's do ASP.NET Script Manager. Script Manager 1. Let's do a run at a server. And then let's go ahead and bake in a reference to my web service. So if I do services, do an add script reference or service reference, path equals, and then I go find my web service and then close that off. What that's going to do is that's going to say to Ajax, hey, you can work and you can use this particular web service to do work against. Now, what's really kind of net new from a Visual Studio perspective is I can actually start to get Intellisense within this particular web service. So currently, though, if you go here and you start plugging in and you start saying web service 1, you're probably wondering, hey, it's not showing up. This is one of those things where they talk about the fancy feature, they just forget to tell you the details. You got to build the web application and launch it, because what's happening underneath the covers is that Visual Studio is going in and reading the WSDL file live and generating that JavaScript proxy in the background for everything to work. So you do actually need to launch the this service. So I've just launched the web app as a whole. I'll just detach from that instance. And then if I close everything out here with any luck, I should be able to go ahead and get the full IntelliSense for it. So let's find out if it works as advertised here. So there we go. Web application 1 dot web service dot hello world. There we go. And then it's going to automatically bake on 3 properties onto it. So it's already done all the async work as well, which is kind of cool. So you don't have to do this is not rocket science to do Ajax anymore. So I'm going to create a method called onSuccess, and then I'm not going to worry about failure or any user contexts. Let's do function onSuccess results, because I'm getting a string back. And then I'm going to go do, let's see, var element, my div element equals document.getElement by ID, and what did I call it earlier? I called it foo. I'm going to say foo.innerHTML is equal to result, oops, not resize, results, and then I'm going to save that. I'm going to come back here, and you can see it's posted in my result from my web service. So, within a few steps, I've created a web service, exposed stuff, and then I've got asynchronous callbacks very easily with full IntelliSense inside Ajax. I think that's pretty cool. But what happens when things screw up? Because inevitably they do with JavaScript. And traditionally today, you kind of double-click that ugly yellow icon in the corner, and it pops up this dialog and tells you got a problem on this line. And of course, you're thinking to yourself, oh, Jesus, where do I begin as far as debugging all that sort of stuff? In the server side, we just set a breakpoint, hit run, and start stepping through the code. Well, the good news is you've got that in for the client side now. So to see what, I can go see what div element's all about if I look here in the window, and I can start to poke at all the different functionalities and features there. So I've got full DOM debugging right here in the window. And on top of that, I've also got this thing here called script documents in my Solution Explorer. And what it's showing me is that I've got the main page loaded default ASPX, but I've also got these other pages, or these other JavaScript files that came down. Because maybe the problem's not in the JavaScript I wrote, but in the control I'm using in the JavaScript it emits. And so you can go into there, and you can set breakpoints as well anywhere inside the functions in here, and go ahead and start to troubleshoot those various functions. So I think that's a really powerful debugging tool, because previously you're either on Firefox with Firebug or pretty much Firefox with Firebug. Here you've got essentially all that full richness of the server-side debugging right within the client side. Now, there is a catch here. If you're trying to set a breakpoint and you're wondering, hey, why isn't it working? Well, it's probably because you don't have a certain option checked. And I just want to highlight that for you, because this one stumbles me from time to time. In the Internet options under IE, there's this option called Disable Script Debugging for Internet Explorer. If that is checked, you won't get this debugging working. So you'll hit F5, you'll hit your breakpoint and be wondering, hey, why isn't it picking up? It's probably because that box is checked. So just make sure Disable Script Debugging for IE is turned off so that you can get the full functionality. So that's one of the really neat kind of client-side features to go along with that. In terms of what you're seeing again is that idea that JavaScript in the last 3 or 4 years has become a really important component. And inside Visual Studio 8, they're doing a lot of work to try and increase the ability to use Visual Studio 8 to do really rich debugging for that particular environment. So we talked a little bit about type inferences and references and code documentation. Formatting comes in SP1, so again, if you'd like to use formatting, download the beta of SP1 today. There's nothing in the SP1 beta that will break your existing 3.5 applications. It's all bug fixes for the framework and Visual Studio, but there's nothing new that you can call. For any of the new bits, they all come in separate assemblies. So if you want to use the routing framework, it actually wasn't baked into system.web. There's a separate assembly for that. So you don't have to worry about beta bits getting into your production applications. So that's a really good thing because you can take advantage of all the fixes they've done in the IDE, some of the great client-side stuff that was introduced in the formatting, and not have to worry about breaking playing with your code as far as introducing beta code into your production code. So some really great stuff there. The debugging stuff for me, if you're doing any sort of client-side stuff, that's really the reason to go to VS08 to get that really full, rich client-side debugging bits. The other thing they've done is introduce a few new controls. Not many, and they were done with essentially a single purpose in mind, and, two purposes in mind. One was link, and the other one was because there's a lot of outcry in the community around table-based layout. The idea essentially of good web development from a public perspective, and the thinking is somewhat different inside the corporate environment, but from a public web perspective, your HTML should represent your data and not really look as much at how it needs to be marked up for the purposes of visual display. So in the past, we used to use tables to make sure that our elements were in the center of the page or in this particular position. Well, tables were never intended to be that. Tables are to really demonstrate, or not demonstrate, to represent tabular data. So I need to display the results from last night's cricket match. I would do that inside a tabular element because it says here are the teams and then here are the various stats on the particular match. That's what tables were meant for, not for layout purposes. And so when they, again, the community has been saying for some time, you've got to stop using table layout. In Visual Studio 5, we saw the CSS adapters ship as the first attempt to undo some of the table layout that was baked inside the framework. In this release, they baked in a new grid because the grid was the notorious heavyweight as far as table layout. So let's look at that and some of the link stuff that was introduced. So link is one of those new things inside the .NET 3.5 framework. And I'm not going to go too heavily into link, but except to say that link is pretty much the kind of next best, or the next thing around data access layers and never writing any more T-SQL again. Let me just make sure my services started here because I see that spinning. So for link, what they've done is they've said, hey, this link thing is catching on, and we need to expose it and make it easy for people to be able to engage at the within the web environment. And so just like we had introduced in some of the earlier versions, we've got a brand new link data source to go along with things. So let me just take a sample database. I'm just working off the database from a previous demo session, and it's called sample content pages. And the database really here isn't as relevant as what I'm going to do to pull out the data. So let's go back to my web form, which is default.aspx. Let's go ahead and get rid of some of this query stuff because we don't need that anymore. And let's pop back over to the design surface. So there's a couple of things that they've done here. They've gone in and created this new link data source. So if you scroll down and go over to the data side of things, you'll see that you've got this link data source. Coming in Service Pack 1, there's this dynamic data manager and this dynamic data source thing and entity data source. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end, but because it's not RTM, anything's game for changing at this point. But the important new thing that's definitely there is the link data source. So kind of like the object data source, you drag it onto the design surface, you configure the data source, and it's linked to really pretty much anything. So I'm here using link to SQL here, but if you want to use link to link to entity framework, or there's even one guy I heard that wrote link to regular expressions. I don't quite understand that, but hey, more power to you if you want to spend the time to create that link. You're going to hit the configure data source, and then of course my Visual Studio is going to sit here and hang. And I've got 10 minutes left, of course, and now it's going to hang. Come on. All right, well, since that's going to hang, I'm going to go ahead and open up a new copy of Visual Studio and continue on with that demo. This is what I get for, oh, no, there we go. It's just simply, all right. It's weird. Okay, well, let's just do it through the properties then, since it doesn't want to work. The link to data source essentially works like any of the other data sources. You assign some values to it in terms of what your data context is, and assign it a variety of different abilities to select data out of that. And then you take a control and you tie it up to it. So let's take the new Listview control, and let's go ahead here to Listview. Listview, where are you? You're under data. Listview essentially is another data grid, and you're asking yourself probably right now, oh geez, another data grid, why would I want that? Well, the main difference between this data grid and the others is that the data grid here was all about letting you go in and modify all of the elements behind how it renders. So this data grid does absolutely, no table-based layout, but if you want to implement it or overwrite various items, you can just have it display not in tables. You can do bulleted lists if you want instead of tables, or change the formatting altogether. By default, it's got a few elements built into it, and with my linked data source acting up here, I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to, because it's not going to hook up all the select stuff. That's weird. All right, I'm going to pull up a pre-baked one where I know it's definitely linking up. And I think it's here. Nope, it's not this one. Of course, I didn't name anything properly, so. All right, I'm just going to keep rolling on here because I can't even remember which folder my pre-baked one is in. So essentially, the list view looks like a grid view and smells like a grid view. It just gives you a whole lot more control over the markup. And for those of you who have fought with the grid view in terms of trying to get it to do what you want to do, you've got full control over what it is that you're able to do within the environment. So I think that's another one of those things. Actually, I think I probably know what's going on is that it was sitting over top of it. But okay, let's continue on here since I only got about 10 minutes left. So the new controls are the list view, the data pager, and the linked data source. If it worked, I would have shown you the data pager. And all they did was take the paging control and separate it from the list view control. It gives you a little more freedom in terms of layout. The other thing that they've done is they've baked in the ability to allow you to do control extenders right within the environment here. So if you've used the ASP.NET Ajax stuff, they've built in the Visual Studio is just being painful today. They've built in the extender notion right into the environment, so I can essentially just attach to any control a particular extender. Hey, now it's actually responding somewhat. Interesting. All right, let's just bang through that. I'm just going to hit finish. I'm going to go ahead and refresh the schema. I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to go ahead and refresh the schema on my list view. And then I'm going to hit Control F5, cross my fingers. And I forgot to specify an item placeholder control ID. Oh yeah, there. And then they're mucked with it. All right, I'm not going to play with that much more. The extender controls, what they did here is, so I've got, let's say, a text box. Let's go ahead and grab a text box out of here. And if I want to add an extender to it, you'll notice off every control, you've got this add extender option here. And so I can go ahead and simply pick the extender that I want, let's say calendar, and I'm going to get rid of this stuff here so it doesn't break my, this next demo. Let's do Control F5 and pull up the script manager. I shouldn't have erased that. Script manager. Save, Control R, there we go. So I'm going to click on my box and I get a calendar. So extenders are really super easy to apply. Takes no real knowledge of the underlying framework to make it work. You just drag it onto the surface and click go. The next thing I want to touch on is building services, and only slightly, just because it seems like as web developers, we often end up building web services as well. And if you're building web services today, doing ASMX web services, Windows Communications Foundation is really something you ought to start looking at, because it takes that notion of web services and extends it to services in general. So I can build just a generic service and choose to expose it via HTTP, via TCP, name pipes, MSMQ, whatever I want. It's also format agnostic in a number of ways, and so they've extended WCF to output JSON, RSS, and just plain old XML objects. And that's something that's really interesting, because now I can create a web service and just have it feed into my feed reader or pull into an AJAX service and not have to write all kinds of middle plumbing work that would typically do that. The last couple things I'll talk about are the web deployment projects. So they've built in this idea of being able to deploy stuff, and in the past you just do a build, and then you'd have to go in and copy and exclude the CS files. The web deployment project essentially makes a deployable ready unit, and it's kind of like the bin debug is in console apps and class libraries. It actually creates a debug folder and a release folder and puts a deployable version of your web application in there. And it does a bunch of other things as well. It will compile the assemblies down into one single assembly, and this was the ASP.NET Merge tool that shipped in the VS05 timeframe. They built that all into the UI. What is net new as far as this functionality is they've done config substitution, and what this says is that I can take the web config as part of my solution and say, I've got settings that are specific to my development environment in there, but when I want to go deploy it, I want to get rid of those development settings. And a great example of the one setting that a lot of people forget is compilation debug equals true. You should never deploy that into production, if anything, for performance reasons, because it adds all kinds of overhead to the execution of your application. So now you can build a deployment project that substitutes that and switches it to debug equals false, and then deploy that as part of it. I don't have enough time to dig into it, but you can certainly take a look at that. I want to talk a little bit about Service Pack 1, though, just before we wrap up. Service Pack 1 introduces, as I was mentioning before, a bunch of JavaScript formatting pieces, and by and large is a performance increase in terms of the enhancements, not only to Visual Studio, but as well to the overall .NET framework. Launch time for applications on first run, click once deployment, WPF performance, all improved. And so that's a fairly significant service pack in terms of what they're estimating. It's due in the SQL Server 2008 timeframe, if I had to tie it to something, so Q3 of this year. On the ASP.NET side, the data scaffolding work, or what was known as ASP.NET dynamic data, is now baked into the framework. And this is really going after the Ruby on Rails crowd to say, hey, there's an alternative in the .NET world. We have our own data scaffolding. And I don't have enough time to kind of go into that, but that's kind of interesting for specific scenarios. They've also taken the MVC framework, and out of MVC to date, they figured out routing. Routing, they figure, is pretty much locked down at this point, and so they've moved that into the framework. And I would expect to see that with a lot of the out-of-band releases is, as they get to a point where they feel like it's mature enough, they'll look to move it into the framework. So as the next version of the framework comes out, you'll see a bunch of other features move into that, just like AJAX did, just like the routing did in this particular release, and so on. One of as you guys are probably aware that trying to shuffle things around the world on the internet does take some toll in terms of latency. One of those features that will help you from a perf perspective is certainly the composite scripts. Every time your web app has to go and cycle through an HTTP request, there's all kinds of setup and teardown. And so they added another element that will allow you to take all those JavaScripts, those 5, 6, 7, 8, or tens of JavaScripts, and send them all in one HTTP request by merging them all together. And that's the composite script stuff. And that's coming out as part of Service Pack 1. It's due out, like I say, over the next couple of months, and it's if you're on VS08, it's a must-have. There's no doubt about it. And I'd encourage you to start playing with it today. Like I say, you can work on it within a production machine and not have to worry about introducing beta code into your environment unless you choose to add those bits that are specific, those new functionality bits that are specific to the beta release. As well, all kinds of performance and caching stuff. I don't have enough time to really dig into it, but certainly something to check out there. There's some stuff that you ought to know about. If you don't really know about Scott Guthrie's blog, he walks through a whole ton of this stuff and gets into, gives some great links in terms of where to go further into it. So definitely check out Scott Goo's blog. I've linked to the one particular post, shrinkster.com/xv1, and that's got the particular tour of what's new in Visual Studio 2008. If you don't have Visual Studio 2008 and you want to start playing with it, get Visual Web Developer 2008. It's absolutely free. It's the Express edition. It doesn't have all the enterprise type features like unit testing and stuff, but it'll get you exposed to the IDE and some of the stuff that's new in the framework. It's a free download. It's the best money you'll ever spend, which is none. If you're going to go ahead and use Visual Studio 08 with IIS7, because they shipped at different time frames, there are some little gotchas. And again, I've included the link up there, shrinkster.com/xv0, in terms of how to get those two working together. Again, Visual Studio 08, when you try and open a website via HTTP, it's looking for front page server extensions. Front page server extensions is finally starting to go away, and so there's some kind of workarounds to make that happen. And then just keep an eye on ASP.NET in general. There's a lot of neat new stuff coming out. They're trying to get stuff out as quickly as possible, and that's why you're seeing a lot of out-of-band releases, because that's their way of saying we don't want to wait for the next major release to start showing some stuff that we think is cool. And as you guys feed back and use it, and activity happens around these projects, that's partly what decides what happens in the next release. So that's all I've got. That's kind of your whirlwind tour of what's new in VS08. There's a lot. If you're on 05 today, I really encourage you to start playing with 08. If you're on 08 today, check out Service Pack 1. And if you're on Visual Studio 2003, do me a favor, treat yourself to a little bit of Visual Studio 2008. I think you'll be quite happy with it. Thank you very much, and any questions? Nope? All right. Well, thank you very much, folks.